Hello, everyone. This is Mohammad Khoshan, the Technical Chair of TPEC 2021. Hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. At this session, we are having our first plenary session on a very interesting topic with distinguished panelists and session chair, both from academia and the industry side. The panel topic today is DER deployment for sustainability, solutions in technology, market, and cyber domains. Let me briefly introduce the panelists and the session chair. The session chair is Dr. Anurag Srivastava, who is an associate professor at Washington State University, WSU. He has done great works in the operation and cybersecurity of a smart grid and microgrids and phasor management-based analysis. We have been collaborating in the UI Assist project, which involves different universities and companies from the US and India. He is the co-lead of this project, and I learned a lot from him. The first panelist is Dr. Alex Papalexopoulos. He is the CEO and chairman of the board at ZOME Energy Company. He is also the president and owner of Eco International. He has done many projects in local energy market design, development, and simulation studies, strategic bidding, and system operation and planning. We also learned a lot from him at the UISS project. The next panelist is Dr. Farrokh Rahimi, who is the Senior Vice President at Open Access Technology International, OATI. He carries a unique experience in analysis and design of ISO and RTO power markets, smart grid application, design of demand response schemes, and design and execution of distributed energy resource management systems. He received his PhD from MIT. During his wonderful career, he worked 3 years at ABB. He was a university professor and consultant in Iran for 10 years. 5 years at Macro Corporation, and he collaborated with California ISO for 8 years prior to joining OATI in 2006. The next panelist is Dr. Robert Simpson. He's a system architect at GE Grid Solutions. He conducts research on the Internet of Things, smart grid architectures, network protocols, internet measurements, and cybersecurity. By the way, he does not like the term cybersecurity and would rather to use information security. He will explain why. He is also the vice chair of IEEE 2030.5 IEEE standard for smart energy profile application protocol. Last but not least, we have Dr. Nikhil Gourisetti. He is the cyber system team lead at Pacific Northwest National Lab, PNNL. His area of expertise includes, but not limited to, cybersecurity, blockchain technology for energy, IoT, physics-driven machine learning, and software engineering. In a nutshell, he is our blockchain person, and we'll talk about the blockchain application in power and energy sectors. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Srivastava to kick off the session. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So, another advantage of having this online panel is a great list of panelists. And I'm so glad that we have 4, very well-known panelists in this plenary session. So objective today is basically talk about a DR-rich power grid and what are the challenges, opportunities, and solutions. And especially given that a lot of solutions that even running in the field is coming from a list of panelists who are participating here. I really look forward to hear and learn more. So with that, 2 more things. I just like to emphasize that if you have questions, please ask in chat box. And in the end, so we'll do 2 to 3 questions after each talk. And then in the end, we'll do kind of panel and then take more questions. And it'll be good if all of you panelists can do like a 15 to 20 minutes talk and and make it more interactive. So hopefully, question will keep coming while you're presenting. All right, with that, I think Alex, it's all yours to start.
Thank you. Let me share my screen.
Sure.
Do you see my screen?
We see it. Yep.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Mohammed, for your kind introduction, for inviting me to speak here in this conference. We are market designers first and foremost. With my company, Eco International, we have designed and implemented maybe 15 markets around the world, in the US, North America, basically, South America, Europe, and Asia. 8 years ago, I realized that we are focusing too much on generation. There are a lot of other things happening on the demand side. We have designed several demand response programs for the ISOs, but really, demand response has not really harnessed the maximum value. So we started this company, ZOME, with several other people. And this company is a software company. We are developing software in the cloud to participate, aggregate devices, and offer them to market participation. So in this presentation, I'll share with you the methodology we follow, the problems we have, the challenges, and what we're trying to do with this basically company, which in essence aggregates devices behind the meter. So I will talk for a minute about the emergence of a decentralized energy model. I'll talk about the energy cloud, the importance of aggregating assets. There are major benefits from aggregation. I will talk a little bit about the distributed stochastic control approach we follow. This is very important. That's all. This is in the cloud. I'll talk about the emergence of hierarchical markets. We have wholesale markets, retail markets, markets behind the meter, transactive energy markets. And we really want to participate in all these markets in an unfettered way. In other words, I can participate simultaneously behind the meter in the distribution market and also the wholesale market. Now, there are certain restrictions in terms of making money from these different markets, but we really believe in the revenue stacking model to make this business financially viable. I will close with really the essence of our work, which is the value of DR aggregations, how we create a supply curve in order to participate in markets, okay? So this is very, very simple. Of course, people understand that. For so many years, we had a centralized model, one way from the generation to transmission to distribution. Things were simple. Now we're moving to a decentralized environment where we have all these devices at the end of the grid, from renewables to hydro to EV charges, smart factories, smart buildings, smart homes. And now this changes totally the way we operate. First of all, we have two-way flows now, but all this information goes to the cloud. And I will explain in the next slide why this is happening. There are two major forces, huge market forces, and we're in the middle of these two market forces. On the right here, we have the IoT revolution. Everything now, basically, from smart thermostats, hot water heaters, everything has connectivity, connects to the cloud. You can control it through the cloud or manually. And on the other side, we have basically all these policies to decarbonize the grid. So we're moving to a smart grid. Different jurisdictions are in different stage of development, but nevertheless, these huge market forces are really shaping the future as far as our business, what we're trying to do. So we're in the middle of this. So markets are evolving. We're moving to the end of the grid with cloud computing technologies, and we aggregate capacity from these IoT devices to offer it to markets. That's the essence of the whole thing. So basically, we create what we call the energy cloud. At the bottom here, you see on the left, various devices that have been available for a long time from wireless controllers, home managed systems, smart buildings. But then on the right, you have new devices like distributed generation, solar, wind, storage, EV charges. You take all this in the cloud. And the important thing for us, that's the way we do it, we create what we call load trances that have different flexibility characteristics. So we bundle together those devices with different load flexibility characteristics. And this is very important. It's because it reduces uncertainty. It's like having a mutual fund. It's the equivalent of a mutual fund to reduce your risk and reduce your uncertainty. So that's what we do. We aggregate load trances of different flexibility, a different risk profile. So the software in the cloud, we call it ZOME, that's the name of the company, ZOME Optimization Platform. It balances supply and demand. It goes to buildings, retrofits buildings, and I explain later what I mean by that. And we create this capacity by looking at all the devices close to the end of the grid. And we offer this capacity to wholesale and retail markets. So at the core of the whole thing is the ZOME Cloud. We have, over the last 7 years, 15 patents on this. This is a back end based on microservices. And on the front end, we have a ZOME kit that basically pulls data every second, sends to the cloud, and the cloud is based on distributed control and controls all these devices you have to see, smart thermostats, switches, solar storage, and charges. So on the lower right part here, this is basically the secret sauce, the ZOME kit. The ZOME kit, that's where we have the 15 patents here. You mount this in the building and pulls all the data that you see around, sends them to the cloud, and the cloud does distributed stochastic control. It sends a signal back to the devices to control them based on the activation information it gets from an ISO, let's say, or a retail market, a DSO. Now, the way this works, basically, we have done extensive research. For this to succeed, we need two things. First, it should be automatic. And number two, we should inconvenience the customer. So the customer tells us which device is flexible. For example, a pool pump is flexible 24/7. You can move it around, shift it during the day, there's no problem. Has a green color, or emergency devices curtail me under certain conditions, or no flexibility at all, don't curtail me at all. So the consumers are at the center of this action. We follow certain priorities, and we get the signal, the deployment signal from an ISO to activate some DR, and some devices are being activated. We start from the flexible, and then we go to emergency if we have to. The distributed control is based on a modified Markov process. Each device has 4 states. E is for enabled, D is for disabled, R is for refractory. In other words, once you move to a disabled state, means being curtailed, you stay there for certain milliseconds before you go back. That's the refractory state. And then flexible, you're eligible to switch. So the whole idea is we have a flexibility budget, and we control with an optimization function those transitional probabilities, the P on and the P off. Going, for example, for disabled refractory to disabled flexible, there is a time delay, as I said. So we optimize those probability distribution functions, and that's how we control the devices. Now, the math is complicated, but in essence, we follow 4 objectives. Number 1, the most important one, goal tracking. If an ISO tells me, give me 2 megawatts, I have to give him 2 megawatts. That's the goal tracking. And I start from the flexible devices, and then I go to emergency. Second, tier priority. Devices with lower number tiers, again, remember, we divide the total load in flexibility tranches, should be shut off less frequently than devices with a higher tier. Fairness, this is very important. When a goal leads to some devices with a particular color being enabled and other devices being disabled, each device in expectation has the same likelihood of being disabled. And on cycling, that's the last objective. No device is unfairly burdened by an initial bad luck, okay? These are all mathematical formulations that go to the cloud based on the color of each device. So after 7 years now, we have products. We're in 4 cities, Portland, San Francisco, Texas, Dallas, Austin, and Washington, D.C. And we go to markets that we like. For example, PJM or ERCOT. ERCOT is a good market for traders. There's a lot of volatility. And CalISO. So we start from the left, we retrofit devices, and we put smart hot water heaters, load switches, and we create a microgrid in a building level. And then with that ZOME kit, we aggregate all the buildings in the area, and we create a VPP. I'll talk about the importance of the virtual power plant later and what we do to make it happen and participate in markets. I want to spend 1 minute for this important slide, okay? Now we have 20 years ago, when I started this 25 years ago with the wholesale markets, we have built many of those around the world. Always will be there, but the game now has shifted close to the end of the customer. Below the TNT interface, I have these DSOs here. LEM, it's a local energy market. We developed the first nodal DSO in England that produces LMPs at the customer level, okay? So below that, we have behind the meter end-use customers. And now, with the third quarter 22, I can aggregate these things, bypass distribution, and go directly to wholesale. This is allowed. So this is an important multi-tier hierarchical market structure. And as I said, depending on the transactions you do, you may have some violations of distribution grid. We have actually a software now that we iterate with the MIP optimization engine based on the information we get from DRs, and we iterate with unbalanced, asymmetric distribution power flows to produce prices per node, per phase for distribution. Again, I'm a big proponent of revenue stacking model. In those 3 markets, wholesale, distribution, customer, you see a lot of applications here, a lot of services we can provide. And we want to participate in all 3 markets at the same time. Now, there are certain restrictions about double dipping and triple dipping, but in essence, if I have 2 megawatts that can help me reduce the demand charge behind a customer to reduce his demand charge, I can use the same capacity to defer the congestion in a distribution level, and at the same time offer it for regulation. I see no problem why we should not do this, and we manage the risk. We have multiple bosses, let's say. We manage our risk, we manage the instructions, but that's what we want to do. I will talk for a few minutes about aggregation. This is so important. Aggregation is so important. People think that I can have all these devices that can register, go to the DSO, go to the ISO and register. We have done a lot of analysis in this. We can certainly unlock value of DRs with aggregation, but we need to pay attention. Some aggregations are fundamental. In other words, we take advantage of economies of scale and economies of scope, and we manage the risk and uncertainties, and that's great because we align the private value with the system value. So this alignment maximizes the social welfare. There are other types of aggregations, we call them transitory, that basically the DR aggregator helps the DRs, deals with the market complexities or information gaps. The DRs or the customers, they don't have idea about how LNP markets settle, that loads settle zonally, generations settle nodally, but as a DR aggregator, I know this information. I can dispatch loads at very high price locations to reduce costs. So there are costs like customer engagement, complex registration between processes. So I can provide some value, but I call it transitory because it can go away as technology develops. For example, if we settle loads nodally, the value for me for the aggregation in terms of LMP settlement goes away. The third aggregation I call opportunistic, because in this case, the DR aggregator gets value, we call it private value, but this is at the expense of system value. Having developed wholesale markets for 20, 25 years, we know games that people can play if they're on both sides of congestion, with allocation of ancillary services, balancing costs, especially in Europe that there's no nodal, then there's a lot of gaming that can happen. So we call those opportunistic aggregations. This is the essence of our work, okay? And I'm closing with a couple of more slides. On the left, I do what I just discussed, the aggregation, okay? I goes to the cloud, I create this. Lower middle part, I create what I will call a portfolio of demand resources that have different colors, meaning I have different flexibility. And those load tranches have different risk profiles. The risk profiles are assigned a probability of curtailment, and the probability of curtailment is assigned a payoff function to the customer. A customer can tell me, I can take some risk, curtail based on that risk, and I want to be compensated. So there is a compensation versus risk. We integrate that information using what we call contract design, supply function determination, and the yield energy determination to come up at the end with the upper left, which is a supply curve. Eventually, that's the curve we submit to markets. It's like a generator. We submit that curve like a generator to the market to participate in different services. I will expand on this slide with two more slides and I'll close. There's a lot of economic theory behind it, okay? The dispatch frequency of the devices is based on subscription contracts. These are contracts we sign with customers. The customers tell us the probability of curtailment as a function of compensation, the payoff function. A customer, for example, in a specific building with the tenants, they tell us, look, I wanna be curtailed only when there is total flexibility. I don't want to be inconvenienced at all. Okay, the payoff function for this tenant is lower. So there is the payoff function couples the probability of curtailment with the compensation. So those contracts, this menu of contracts are aggregated in a demand resource portfolio, and these contracts comprise the VPP elements. So now, once I have this portfolio of contracts, based on the composition of these contracts, that I need an additional information, what we call the yield statistics. Then the DR aggregator constructs the supply function to offer it to market. So what is the yield distribution? The yield distribution, every device, we need to determine for every device and every load tranche, I need to determine how much energy I can get from that device per kW of capacity. Or if I have 1 megawatt capacity, how much energy I can get out of it, depending on the weather conditions, depending on the zip code, depending on so many other things. That's where the predictive analytics come in, and AI comes in, because I may have a capacity of 2 megawatts. I'm not going to be 2 megawatts at an ISO, because if I need to be curtailed, I will not be able to deliver 2 megawatts. So the yield distribution is very important because it guides the deployment of this controllable demand capacity to deliver a specified amount of energy for a given probability. And this is, I think, the last slide. All this ties together now with math to come up with a yield calculation, the supply function to offer it to markets, the contract design. Contract design is very important, okay? It's very important. There's a whole economic theory behind it. So the supply function that I bid into the market at the corresponding deployed capacity basically is calculated in such a way to maximize the expected net revenue. It's a function of the market price. It's the equivalent of the supply curve that conventional generators submit to the market. Now, the market clearing price that is coming out of the market for a specific product is scaled with the expected yield, okay? It gives you the marginal valuation of the device. Now, this is very important. There are privacy concerns here, okay? There are cyber concerns. I'm not a cyber guy. I have a couple of cyber guys in my company to deal with this. Everything is in the cloud, all these devices. There are cyber security issues, of course. Investors keep asking about this, how to deal with cybersecurity. How about if somebody hacks the ZOME kit or if somebody hacks the devices? An important observation is that there is inherent private information here, okay, regarding those valuations. So the curtailment compensation, how much I'll pay a tenant, contains what we'll call an information rent, which is beyond the foregone value of the curtail load. That information rent, it's the equivalent that we have in the wholesale market for the payment we provide to inframarginal units in a uniform price auction, okay? So that's important. So once I get an award from a market, then we realize the deployment by using the load control of the ZOME cloud. Of course, if there are deviations, these deviations are settled in the real time. If you follow this presentation, you can see as a DR aggregator, we don't expose our customers to marginal prices. We can see marginal pricing, but we don't believe, and this is fundamental to our technology, to marginal pricing for residential customers. For products like electricity or internet or like water, marginal pricing has no really role. We have done extensive research on this. Look at the internet plan you have with your internet provider. You don't pay marginal pricing to call New York. You pay based on a plan, a service plan. We emulate that telco model in our business. Now, we as DR aggregators, we can expose to be marginal pricing, but our customers should not. And I will close with that. So in essence, the game has shifted to distribution behind the meter. Technology allows it. So the centralized model is giving away to another type of model. DRs are really rapidly evolving. What I presented is a platform using distributed stochastic control to aggregate assets, offer this capacity to solve wholesale and retail problems, okay? The aggregators can provide value. No, don't take me wrong, but we need to make sure that the private value aligns with the system value. And as I said at the end, this demand resource portfolio we create is fundamental, but it requires extensive analysis of the energy yield, the supply function, and we couple this with the contract design with the customers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was great as always. I think hopefully everyone who attended is learning. But I had some questions. So you said that one distribution market that you developed in England, is that for the whole country or is it part of the country?
It's part of the country. It's southern London. There are two distribution companies, UK Power Networks and WPD. And the model we use in Europe, I think, will be a little bit different than the model we have in the US. Europeans unbundle things much more than we do. And they don't want the owner of distribution, like a distribution company that owns pulsed wires, also to be the market, the DSO. They want the DSO to be a different entity. Here in the US, it seems we're behind on this, but it seems that the governance will be different and the DNO will be the DSO. Now, there are advantages to both, I mean, a disadvantage to both models, don't take me wrong. Every model has some advantages and some disadvantages. Nevertheless, it seems that many people in Europe that we do a lot of work there promote a model in Brussels that the market, let's say the DSO, the platform that clears offers, is different from the owner of the distribution grid. Okay, so this thing we developed, actually, I think it's the first in the world actually to produce LNPs, DLNPs, all the way to the customer level for asymmetric, unbalanced distribution grids. But it can work. We made a lot of mistakes. We thought that what we learned for 20 years from the wholesale market is portable. It's not really, because the transmission grid behaves very well. It's single phase, we have good data, we have nice PTDFs, the system is meshed, we can solve congestion. In distribution, there are different problems. So even though what we learn from wholesale is still relevant, but there's a lot of new work here.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think we will take one more question, and I see one in chat, that how you think Order 2222 of Farrokh will affect the future of local energy markets in the US? Is it against it, or it acts as a motivation for DR to participate more?
Yeah, I think it's a landmark order, okay? We're very happy to see that. Of course, different ISOs are in a different level of development. CalISO has these concepts from 2016. We follow the CalISO developments. We're in California. We spent 8 years in California and so developing. Actually, I was the technical lead of the project going nodal at the CalISO. We follow the market, but other ISOs are a little bit behind. What Farrokh 2222 does set some principles, but if you look at the details, a lot of things need to be worked out. Actually, there are some conflicts within Order 2222. I just want to tell you, this is great for the DR business, but many states don't like the Order 2222. They don't want their assets, the distribution assets to go to the wholesale market. So many states are threatening Farrokh that they will take it to court, that Farrokh overreached its authority to put out this order. I hope the order will stay in most of the country because it's great for DRs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there are more great questions, but we will hold on to that towards the end. And thanks again. And our next panelist will be Farrokh.
Okay. Let's see if I can start sharing my screen. Can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Let me go here to the presentation mode. All right. Thank you very much for your invitation, and thanks to all of the attendees. I heard you're from different time zones, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on your time zone.
Farrokh, you may want to minimize the Zoom window on the top left.
Minimize, here.
The videos, yeah.
Okay, let me just put it down here. Is that okay? Well, all right, is that okay?
No, we still see it. It's on top of your slide, the videos. So
So
the videos.
that might be yours because I don't see it. I see his
okay.
only.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Anyway. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry. All right. So thanks for the introduction. Just a brief introduction of the company I work for, Open Access Technology International, headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with branch offices, one here in Northern California, where I work from. Of course, right now I'm working out of my home, and the two main offices in North and South India. The company was established 25 years ago at the dawn of restructuring of the electric industry in North America, and provides software as a service solutions to the energy industry from these two data centers in North and South Minneapolis. These are 6th generation NERC SIP data centers, SIP compliant data centers. The company has about 1,100 staff, more than 1,100 staff, and serves more than 2,200 energy industry customers that include, among others, FERC and NERC, a lot of utilities and basically traders and so on. Now, the company, as I said, started 25 years ago, mainly in the area of transmission reliability and management, providing these, all of the solutions are provided software as a service in the cloud. And as of 5-6 years ago, we also started developing some grid edge devices similar to what Alex was talking about. Ours is called My Grid Switch and Grid Port that sit close to the distributed energy resources to gather information and control and basically act as low-cost sensing and control devices. The company then moved to energy trading and risk management system, and finally, about 12 years ago, used the platform to build upon it solutions for the smart grid, as it is called. Now, this development basically follows what we see in our industry after about 100 years of electric industry operating the same way. 25 years ago, we had restructuring of the electric industry around the world. And in North America, it started with FERC Order 888 in 1996, and 3 years later, Order 2000, that created the ISOs and RTOs. And at that time, the main concern was management of the transmission system and management of the bulk power transactions. And at that time, mainly if you look at the design of these markets, and I was involved 8 years with California ISO, and I was one of the principal designers of the MRTU and their expert witness in front of the FERC. So I have gone through all of the experience of both good and bad market designs. And at that time, the assumption was that the load is inelastic. It took about a decade. FERC came out with Order 719, in which it really realized that no, demand-side assets can play a role in the bulk power market, in provision of services that the bulk power market needs. And a couple of years later, 3-4 years later, with Order 745, that basically stipulated these demand-side assets should get paid the LMP of the bulk power markets if they provide a benefit. And then around a decade later, FERC came out with FERC Order 841 for participation of storage in the bulk power markets. And finally, the main thing, Order 2222, that they refer to it as FERC 2x4, that came out in September 2020. And really what it did is the same kind of fundamental change in the electric industry going forward that FERC Order 888 did 25 years ago for the bulk power market. Now, with this change that we see on the left with darker color, we see the traditional players in the bulk power market. And then in the blue on the right, we see the new players and the contributions they can make to both, if they're not managed properly, create problems, particularly for the distribution system that's sitting in between these grid edge assets and the bulk power market. But if managed properly and through distributed energy resource management systems, it can provide valuable services to the bulk power market, capacity, energy reserves, etc., as well as to the distribution grid itself, provide voltage support. Normally, voltage support in the bulk power markets is not one of the products in the spot markets. They're recruiting bulk power based on long-term contracts, but at the distribution level, it's one of the important products. So at the center of this thing, of course, what we see, as Alex pointed out, we see the emergence of the DSOs, the traditional role of distribution utility as distribution operator, which was responsible mainly for planning of the distribution, protection, and so on and so forth, is now emerging and expanding to really manage and deal with all of these distributed energy resources, whether they are going from the grid edge assets to the bulk power market, going through the distribution system, or even more recently, transactive exchanges among the prosumers, microgrids with one another, that they also will have to go through the distribution system, the distribution grid. So the distribution system operator needs more and more new tools to deal with this. In this graph, basically you see the evolution of what is happening with respect to the applications that are needed to help the operation of the system as the level of DERs increase. At the low level, basically, we used to have the distribution scatter, distribution automation, demand response management system, AMI, advanced metering infrastructure. When the level of distributed energy resources go higher, then we really need to provide the distribution utilities, particularly with distributed energy resource management systems, or DERMS, and advanced DMS. And what is emerging with the emergence of DSOs and transactive energy, some additional functionalities that these platforms need to provide. Now, Alex talked about mainly the aggregators, and now because most of our clients are utilities and they're sitting between these grid edge assets and the bulk power markets, when we talk about DERMS, or distributed energy resource management systems, we pay particular attention to the needs of these distribution utilities. In this diagram, what we are showing in the middle is the main components of DERMS, including forecasting, optimization, and management of congestion and bottlenecks in the distribution grid, volt-var management, but also we see all of the grid edge assets that either participate in local markets, as Alex referred to briefly, which is emerging, or according to FERC 2222, they go to the bulk power market and in the process impact the distribution system. We, of course, this DERMS platform has to have connectivity to the conventional legacy systems of distribution utility, including the customer information system, CIS, geographic information system. These are the ones shown on the left, and provide portals for both the operators of the distribution system as well as participants in these local markets or aggregators that really need to go through the distribution system to the bulk power market. Some of the recent rulings, although it's not mentioned in FERC order 2222, there are coordination requirements between the ISO RTO and DSO, and also the aggregators to inform the DSO as to what they are doing. This picture sort of illustrates these functions or applications that are accommodated in distributed energy resource management system, the way that we have implemented here in our cloud. And we call it TDERMS because in addition to managing distributed energy resource management, it has to accommodate peer-to-peer transactions as well. So you have a lot of functions. Because of in the interest of time, I won't go through the details of all of these, but it has to accommodate these functionalities. Among these, the important part is modeling of all of these different assets, including inverters, storage elements, etc., modeling their capabilities so that they are taken into account when you are doing availability forecasting for these assets, how much they can provide. Alex talked about, okay, how much can a particular asset provide under different conditions, depending on time of the day, ambient conditions, how much it was used before. All of those considerations have to be included as information in this distributed energy resource management system when it is doing the management of the assets to meet the requirements of the grid and make sure that does not produce any unwanted impacts and constraints into the distribution system. Scheduling, dispatch, and control is an important function. Again, I won't go into the details of this, but when the aggregators are participating, depending on the kind of programs, they can be on a notification-based kind of dispatch or schedule, a direct control, whatever. So these modes are depending on the programs that they are signed up under with the particular distribution utility, as well as some of the programs that they have signed up with the bulk power market to participate in those markets. Now, the distribution utility normally has visibility to the substations, not all the way to the grid edge assets. So some of the developments, particularly what we have here, we call it the IoT SCADA, that feeds the DERM solution, goes all the way to the service point. And as I said, these small boxes that are shown in the bottom are modems, grid ports that sit next to the assets, similar to what Alex was describing with their ZOME kit. So similar type of situation, and communicates with our cloud in Minneapolis. This geographical vision of the distribution grid and the ability to control open and closed switches and so on. This is also an important element for the distribution system operator, and this is also provided in this kind of a solution. And a few words about, I talked about mainly the distributed energy resource management system for a distribution system operator at the power, at the ISO RTO level. You don't really want to bother them with doing anything with their bulk power market. So this kind of a system at the bulk power market would sit next to their SCADA system and will communicate to the distributed assets, not all the way to the assets, but to the point of delivery of the aggregators. For example, aggregators deliver under a particular substation or further down at some voltage levels, maybe in the future at the boundaries of the local markets. And so this IoT SCADA is supposed to supplement what is available in the control center of the ISRTO in this case. And now going forward, we are adding a blockchain. We have actually started adding blockchain for peer-to-peer transactions sitting on this platform. And so I won't go into the details of that unless there are questions. I will close by simply sort of project that we have in Hawaii, in which we are leveraging demand-side assets to provide services to the Hawaiian electric companies, HECO, and a number of services, capacity reduce, capacity build, FFR, fast frequency response. But the most importantly, we are doing also a project, a pilot project that basically uses these demand-side assets in Hawaii, in this example, a number of EV chargers that are used to provide regulation, frequency regulation in Hawaii, but under the control from our cloud in Minneapolis. So the red box there is our cloud in Minneapolis. These grid ports that are sitting in the field in Hawaii communicate with our cloud, and then our cloud receives 4-second dispatch signal, regulation signals from the control center. And by the way, all in Hawaii, and by the way, all of this goes through public internet with proper security implemented at various parts, including the grid edge devices, the grid ports, including the software itself in the cloud. And we did some tests and used the PJM performance indicators. I won't go into the detail in here. PJM defines a regulation performance score for units that provide regulation in PJM, consists of a correlation score, delay and precision score, and a composite score. As I said, I won't go into the details of this in the interest of time. I only show here a sample of the regulation signal we received, AGC signal in blue, and the response of the virtual power plant in Hawaii that was composed of a number of combination of electric water heaters and EV chargers, and the kind of a score that we got here was in the order of about 95% or better composite score. And we compared this with what PJM reports on the regulation performance score in PJM for different, which is shown in the right, up on the right, the different resource types, hydro, steam, and so on. And the performance in this scores range from 75 to 94. And with this test that we did, the pilot project, we got, as I said, more than 95% score using public internet with proper security. So with that, I will just close by the observations that a variety of grid services can be provided from these demand-side assets, and grid services can be provided incorporating cloud-based solutions, as we did demonstrate, providing asset aggregation, VPP creation, forecasting, availability assessment, optimized dispatch allocation, performance monitoring and settlements, and a properly designed DERMS and IoT SCADA provides a cost-effective solution for providing these services. Even the most stringent one, which is a regulation service, and basically secure public internet, can be used effectively to accomplish that with proper security measures. And with that, I will stop and would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. It was very informative. And so one question we already have, what do you think about business model, especially given that utility has to take service from these DR and they will lose load?
That is a very good question. It goes, in fact, a little bit more than that. A lot of the utilities, they are frowning upon FERC Order 2222 because they say these some of these customers are under net metering, for example, and they provide a service to bulk power market, and they get paid by the bulk power market. At the same time, we have to pay them. So you're quite right that with proliferation of DERs and participation in the markets, they are concerned about that. However, one counteracting factor is the proliferation of electric vehicles. So at the same time that DER's demand reduction reduces the bottom line of the utility, electric vehicles who are classified among DERs by FERC in this order, FERC 2222, they increase the revenue to the utility by consuming electricity. At the same time, they can provide all of these services. So while they're charging and displacing the petroleum, the gas driven vehicles and help the environment and provide these grid services and help improve the utilities bottom line. And the utilities also know this situation, and they have to start offering additional services. A lot of these services that provides them revenues. For example, a lot of these services could be information services to the aggregators, information services to the consumers. So this information has value, and so far as regulatory provisions allow them, and they can find with their PUCs and so on and so forth, and many of them are doing vis-a-vis this FERC order, to get the ability to charge for these additional services.
Thank you. Well,
and by the way, the utilities themselves, there is no interdiction right now in the US, the utilities themselves can act as aggregators as long as they are not facilitating local markets.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I do have more questions, but we will follow up towards the end. Thanks so much again.
Thank you.
And next panelist is Robby.
Thanks. Let's see if I can share my screen. I have to do some kind of privacy granting access. Let me give me 1 second. Well,
We see it.
Ah, okay. Excellent. All right. So first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to participate in the panel today. I've been looking forward to it. A little bit more background on myself, just to put things into context. I am the system architect at GE's Grid Solutions business. I'm guessing everyone's probably already heard of GE, so I'll spare you the company background and introduction there. But Grid Solutions, the part that I work for, is the business that's focused on transmission and distribution. Where I personally have focused more is on the distribution side of things, and so it ties right into what our previous panelists have been discussing. As for myself, my background is primarily in communications and the marriage of those communications with grid assets, especially behind the meter assets. And as part of that, I've been heavily involved in standards, technical standards, in organizations like IEEE, IEC, and IETF. And I've also been involved in some policy work as well. And both standards and policy are very crucial, of course, to making all of this work, as I'll discuss. Some things to point out here. I do chair a standard called IEEE 2030.5, which I'll talk about a bit how that plays in. And let's move on. So I think tying into what some of the previous panelists have talked about, as you've heard, it's very important for these distribution connected DER to start to participate, and this is a new area that's evolving in bulk power markets, and having the ability to communicate with those assets is becoming increasingly important, both from the ability of participating in those markets, but what we're also finding as we focus more and more on distribution connected assets is that the increased penetration of distributed generation there can start to lead to various grid stability issues, particularly at lower levels like a feeder, where you can start to see voltage issues and things like that, as have been touched on a bit earlier. And so far, a lot of that has been managed through autonomous settings in the, say, a solar inverter. They often have their own volt-var curves and various settings that can go into there. But with communications, there's the ability to adjust those curves and to adjust those settings, and to even send time-bounded controls that are not solely focused on generation and demand, but rather focused on kind of the more critical grid stability issues as they arise, which can lead to even further increases in the amount of distributed generation that can be deployed. And then, of course, consumers and prosumers have expressed desire for increased engagement as well as information. So a lot of the engagement thus far we've talked about is around participating in markets, either directly or through aggregators. But also sometimes the consumers just want to have information on, what is their current price, what is their current usage of energy or production, and as we've mentioned, the new market models, either price responsive all the way down to, I think there's some discussions of transactive energy all the way down to individual homes, which, that's perhaps going to happen one day. I'm not convinced. As well as aggregation and the use of aggregators. But one important thing to consider, and the thing that's keeping a lot of the regulators up at night, is that this equipment, these solar inverters, the storage, is being rapidly installed today. And a lot of it is being installed without communications capability for the future. And so that's going to require potentially in the future going back and retrofitting gateways, and then you have the question of who pays for that, and on and on. And so what we're starting to see now is that interconnection rules themselves and various regulations are beginning to require those communications. And furthermore, they're beginning to require those communications in a standardized or interoperable fashion. Some of the regulations that have come into play there, we've talked a lot about FERC 2222 already, which is kind of, in my mind, a motivation for the aggregator market and for getting It's kind of the dollars behind it, getting people excited and wanting to participate. But then there's also regulations just purely around the stability of the distribution level grid. So if you look at California's Rule 21, this is California's interconnection rule. So this is how you can connect, say, residential solar, for instance, to the grid. And as of very recently, they're going to require all new consumer-owned inverters, solar inverters, for example, but also storage, et cetera, to be what is often called "quote unquote" smart. And what is typically meant by smart there is just the ability to communicate. I guess I feel kind of nice being in the communications world that everything we touch ends up being smart. If you look at smart thermostats, it usually means they can communicate. Smart meters, and now we're starting to see smart inverters. And in California, for instance, and we're starting to see in a lot of other places, there's a requirement for a specific communications standard for that, which is IEEE 2030.5. And there's also a significant focus on aggregators as part of the interconnection. I think a lot of the distribution level utilities, the DSOs, would actually prefer to communicate with the aggregators as opposed to down to the potentially millions of inverters that are out there. There's also IEEE 1547, and if you haven't heard of that one, that's a standard that's been around for quite a while. That is focused. It's probably the closest thing we have in the U.S. to a federal interconnection or standard, or a federal standard. And it's in the most recent revision now, it requires that the inverters have communications capability, and it lists one of three, a requirement for one of three standards there. There's IEEE 2030.5, which is probably geared more toward residential consumers. There's DNP3, which is usually more focused on utility-owned assets. And then there's Modbus, which is usually used for local communications to connect with a gateway, for instance. I say usually because all of these, it can get quite complex. But this is the basis for most US interconnection rules, and we're starting to see more and more states within the US look at this. And then I should note that this is, I shouldn't be so purely US focused. A lot of these standards are being used in other places in the world as well. And the ones that I've mentioned specifically are there's a lot of interest, for instance, in Australia, South Korea, a little bit in Europe, and also many countries in Africa as well. And so these recent regulatory changes really emphasize that importance of distribution level DER, both in the participation in markets, but also the ability to communicate with them, especially those that are not owned by the utilities. That's where a lot of the focus is right now. A little bit more on California's Rule 21, the most recent revision, they call them Phase 2, and most of Phase 3 went into effect in June, this past June. So starting June 22nd, all new solar inverters, or all new interconnections basically, are required to have that communications capability. And it covers both the communications between the utility, or the DSO, if you will, and an aggregator, but as well as a utility and the individual smart inverters. 2030.5 was named as the "quote unquote" default protocol, and I'll touch on, I'm not trying to advertise 2030.5 per se, but I'll touch on why it's important to name a default protocol in a moment. And then they've also developed a guide and a lot of testing and certification, and even a certificate authority for the public key infrastructure to enable the interoperable cybersecurity mechanisms. A lot of the differences that we're starting to see architecturally really depends on the ownership there, and a lot of the differences we see in terms of communications. So with kind of traditional utility-owned assets, be they bulk generation or even just large solar farms or things of that nature, you typically have very reliable communications. You'll have field area networks or SCADA networks that are owned by the utility and very well understood. The equipment itself is ultimately under the utility's control. and the equipment is usually purchased through a utility sales channel. And then there's a variety of standards that exist and have existed for quite some time for communications with those equipment. And I point all this out to highlight the difference when it comes to these behind the meter assets or these customer owned assets. The communications are very unreliable. It's usually the customer's own internet connection in a lot of cases, which I don't know about you, but my internet connection sometimes goes out, unfortunately. And you know, since I own it myself, there's nothing to prevent me from just unplugging it or forgetting to pay my bill, et cetera, et cetera. So from a grid standpoint, it's a lot more unreliable. The equipment itself is ultimately under the customer's control. If I put solar on my home, there's nothing to prevent me from messing around with it, from, I don't know, hitting it with a hammer or something else ridiculous. The equipment itself is available in a retail market. And one reason that's very important to highlight is in a utility sales channel, the inverters that are purchased, the equipment that's purchased is usually configured for the grid where it's going to be installed. It'll have its various settings chosen appropriately for the utility that's purchasing it. However, in a retail market, I can get on eBay today and buy a solar inverter with no idea where it's going to be installed. Is it going to be installed in PG&E's territory, or is it going to be installed in somewhere in Texas under, you know, maybe AEP's territory? And each jurisdiction is slightly different. Sometimes they have different curves they want to see. Sometimes they have different voltage requirements. And so it becomes important to not only be able to communicate with those devices, but to be able to communicate with them in an interoperable way. And so far, as far as I'm aware, the only standard that exists for that right now is 2030.5. So that interoperability becomes crucial because this customer-owned equipment is available in the retail market, and the utility doesn't really, or the jurisdiction, I should say, doesn't really control where that equipment is installed. The communications can occur over a variety of medium, over the customer's internet connection. Maybe there's a third-party cellular box that's installed, et cetera. And then there's aggregators that are starting to play an important role in these markets. But there's the need to communicate with those aggregators, and each utility doesn't want to have to communicate with every aggregator in a different way, or every solar inverter in a different way. And also this enables companies like the two we've heard before, ZOME and OATI, to really participate in these markets and not have to have a different standard or a different way to communicate for each and every jurisdiction they're in. It lowers the barrier to entry for new companies to come in and be aggregators, and it enables additional participation from many of these parties. Potentially, everyone can be their own aggregator in a way if we get to that point. And it really just kind of creates a level playing field for innovation. I often like to remind folks that when standards nerds like myself were working on protocols like HTTP, we had no idea that one day it'd be used for things like Facebook. And so when you have interoperable standards in place, it provides a level playing field to really allow folks to innovate on top of that. And this also allows for a lot of customer flexibility. So this allows for the end users to easily be able to change aggregators. And for the, unfortunately, some of these aggregators may not be in business for the 20 years that the solar inverter is installed. And so this allows for, even if you switch aggregators or the aggregator goes out of business or something along those lines, still allows the communications to occur. Otherwise, we have kind of proprietary ways of communicating with each of these inverters where you might get locked into a particular aggregator. You don't really know how it works. It makes a lot of work for everyone involved. And then, of course, even the cybersecurity concerns when you have kind of black box, unknown ways that the cybersecurity is done. We found time and time again that that using open interoperable standards for cybersecurity tends to be the best path forward. Now that I've touched on it, cybersecurity is a critical component here, both from a security perspective as well as far as privacy concerns become quite paramount. I know that, you know, in the standards world, when we were working on things like IEEE 2030.5, we would have folks from the NSA, from NIST, from various government agencies want to come in and evaluate our ways of doing cybersecurity. And of course, that's welcomed and important. And so it's very important to have an open standards platform where you can feel assured that cybersecurity is in place. And then, of course, the attacks, cybersecurity attacks on the grid itself can have significant consequences in the physical world. I mean, you know, if you lose your Facebook account, that's bad, but it's not nearly as bad as a coordinated attack could have actual physical consequences impacting transformers, etc. The design has to be one that there's minimal consumer intervention. So on the one hand, we want it to be super secure, but on the other hand, you don't want your customer to have to go out and mess with the inverter or even mess with their internet firewall if you want to use their internet connection. So these standards have to be designed such that they'll work with existing firewalls, that they work with more advanced mechanisms for registration and cybersecurity credentials. And then on the other hand, this interface is a piece of the consumer's network, so it can't be the weak link there. And at the same time, the rest of the consumer's network may be actively hostile or insecure. I'm sure there are lots of folks that, you know, are constantly testing their own equipment to see how secure it is, and you don't want this to be a weak link, if you will. There's also little to no physical protection of these assets. Utilities, for instance, are often used to their generation equipment being inside a fence and having a lot of physical protection, whereas most solar inverters and storage is installed on the side of a house. But on the other hand, these devices need to last for decades, which makes everything much more complicated because you have to design cybersecurity mechanisms and use standards and protocols that you think will still be useful 20 years from now. And then last but not least, these things need to be designed to meet the cybersecurity guidelines and requirements of all sorts of governments around the world. There's a variety there that have to be met. So I'll just wrap it up to say, you know, the best way to get involved in a lot of this new area and is really to participate. There's a tremendous amount of activity going on both in private companies that are looking to get engaged in these markets, and as well as in the standards world and in the policy world, in ways of trying to best enable these markets so that there's something there to do. And so I think, you know, most of the folks in the presentation today are probably students, and you're getting engaged at a very great time. There's a lot of innovation that can occur, and this is really, in my mind, one of the biggest advances that has occurred in the last 100 years for the electric power system, and both in terms of the markets, in terms of the equipment, in terms of even the physics of it. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are some. Thank you.
Well, I think we have very less time left, but there's one question, and you know, there are a lot of studies going on with respect to cyber attack detection through machine learning, and what do you think about that and practical application?
In terms of, I think, you know, machine learning is yet another avenue for basically doing a lot of penetration testing and a lot of really brute force ways of attacking things, but also, you know, it's like almost throwing even more minds at the problem and finding vulnerabilities. And so, you know, it's a great way to test out these systems. And I would say, you know, kind of on my soapbox of using open standards, one of the benefits of using these open standards is for instance, the same technology we're using to secure these solar inverters is the same technology that's used for online banking. And so we can learn a lot from one another if we operate in these open environments where you can use the brain trust of potentially millions of people, as opposed to the brain trust of, you know, even a very good small company.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. And, you know, I think we'll move on to the next one now. So that will be Sri. And we only have 15 minutes left, so sorry about that, Sri. But we'll, you know, maybe a little bit go over time.
Anurag, you said we have 15 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I can try to keep it short so we have some room for questions. A lot of really interesting presentations in the last few minutes. In this presentation, I'm going to slightly talk about a different topic that has a lot of connection to the concepts that have been discussed in the last few presentations. I'm Sri Nikhil. I'm the energy cybersecurity researcher at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and bulk of my research at PNNL is related to energy cybersecurity, both in the realm of power grid as well as connected buildings. And in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about blockchain explorations from the research and standardization point of view in the area of power and energy. So this is a rough overview or an agenda of what I'm going to present. I will start with some introductory material, then talk about the IEEE 2418.5 standards work. It's an ongoing effort right now. And then finally, I will share some research that is going on at PNNL that is related to exploring what blockchain means and understanding what kind of value proposition does it have when it comes to power and energy related use cases and applications. Before I go into the lot of interesting details related to using this technology or exploring what this technology means in our space, and time to time you will see my cat going back and forth. At this point, I completely ignore him. Coming back to the topic, this is in this particular case. I think most of us know about this technology or heard about this technology. To give a bit of a background, blockchain is one of the type of distributed ledger technologies, or DLTs. And there are other types of DLTs, such as directed acyclic graphs, hash graph, holograph, and etc. Even if we just look at blockchain and how it has evolved so quickly over the last few years, most of us came to know about blockchain or DLTs in general with the whole Bitcoin boom, right? Like, and around that time frame, there was a lot of focus on proof of work consensus, which most of us are familiar with, that involves a lot of energy, that consumes a lot of energy, that involves a lot of miners in forming some sort of a consensus for transactions. And a lot of the applications were very attractive towards cryptocurrency and financial industry. And soon after, we saw some really interesting enhancements to the technology itself. For example, Ethereum is the first one to come up with smart contracts, which is nothing but a software or a piece of code that has the ability to hold rules of governance. It has the ability to run logic. Right? That's when we started seeing interesting applications that go beyond, or that went beyond cryptocurrency, in terms of people started exploring this technology for auctioning, lottery, and real estate escrow. And around this time frame, in the energy or in the power and energy space, we started seeing researchers exploring this technology, especially starting with this public blockchain such as Ethereum, for applications such as transactive energy systems, energy markets, and etc. And beyond that, we saw this burst of different types of architectures, different types of blockchains that started coming out, and some of us are familiar with the Hyperledger platform. That in itself has multiple blockchains, such as Fabric, Sawtooth, and others. And then we saw, we started to see different types of consensus mechanisms, private setting blockchains. And that's around the time frame where researchers started looking into supply chain related applications, distributed network architectures, and coordination. So in summary, this is a technology that brings together concepts from computer science, cybersecurity together, and network engineering together. And when we use it in electrical and power systems engineering, all of a sudden we are making, the complication, the complexity increases further. I think one of our previous speakers talked about the importance of interoperability, importance of using open standards, and using technologies in a scalable fashion, so they will have room for innovation, and they will facilitate room for innovation and interoperability over the course of time, right? And that's one of the goals for why I've been personally involved with IEEE P2418.5 blockchain for energy systems, or blockchain in power and energy working group. One of our speakers, Farrokh, is also one of the members for this particular working group. And the working group itself has a lot of other objectives. I'm going to focus on one of the task forces, which is the cybersecurity task force. And in this, we are looking at a lot of interesting things to address security-related questions, whether it is associated with the technology or implications of using this technology in power and energy applications. So here are some high-level questions we are looking at in this from a standards point of view, right? So in this, we have participants from utility, academia, industry, national labs working together to figure out from a standards point of view, what does this mean? What are the gaps that needs to be addressed? What are the critical questions related to cryptography or scalability, understanding what kind of thresholds we may have when it comes to forming, consensus and for using this technology in a fault-tolerant fashion, and also even understanding what kind of security should be in place from a smart contract or program logic point of view. For example, can we use the existing software development lifecycle best practices towards developing the smart contracts? What kind of limitations that may be associated with the smart contracts? And also looking at different types of use cases. Here we are kind of approaching this more from a point of view of different possible use cases, and then we would like to go into understanding the true value proposition, and of course then finally understanding different kinds of challenges that we have. As part of the IEEE P2418.5 working group efforts, so far this is a work in progress stack. So we came up with what looks like a blockchain DLT stack. So we looked at the different attributes and operations that are inherent to this technology, and there is a lot of existing research and publications that we used as our preliminary information as we started developing this. And we broke it down across 7 different layers, all the way from application layer to the physical layer. And there are no hard boundaries between or hard lines between these different layers, but there is information that may flow between these layers, right, in general. But we wanted to kind of put something that is hierarchical. So as a researcher, if someone thinks about seeing what this technology may offer in terms of their application, in terms of addressing their gaps, at least they can use this as a high-level hierarchical model to architect their solution or potential solutions before they invest time and resources in building this. And at the same time, we started mapping with different types of cybersecurity components, and what kind of impact or what kind of relationship do these components have with this different 7-layer stack. And we just started looking into the interoperability piece. And for example, you would see the smart grid architecture model and how we are mapping that to this particular 7-layer stack. We have a paper coming out of this particular explaining how this stack can be used and the reasoning or the logic behind how this stack has been developed. And we started looking at, can this map to as close as possible, right? To, let's say, from an OSI model point of view, how does that mapping look like from different operations point of view? So I'm sorry about that. I think I may have recorded. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So some of our next steps in this particular working group activities include exploring, diving deep into some of the cybersecurity components, understanding the overlap between the cybersecurity and energy components, and digging deep into aspects such as protocols, right? Like, for example, what does interoperability mean in this particular context? Whether it means working with the existing systems, or interoperability between different blockchains or different DLTs. We would like to dig deep into these different components. And this is a very active working group. And if anyone is interested, just feel free to reach out to me. Yeah. So going from there, I want to talk a little bit. I know we don't have a lot of time about some of the ongoing research at Pacific Northwest National Lab. So to give a rough overview, we are looking at different topics more from an angle of what kind of value proposition does blockchain have in this space? I'm kind of asking the basic questions. What aspects of blockchain make sense? How does it actually, how could it compare against existing solutions? And we want to ask these basic fundamental questions before jumping into architecting a blockchain-based solution. There are a ton of publications that we wrote on these different topics here, and all of them are available online. Again, you can reach out to me if you have any questions. Here is a rough overview of 4 different use cases that we are looking at least we started looking at. A lot of this work started back in 2017, where we started with looking at public blockchains, and then we eventually moved into more in the private and permission blockchains, because that seemed to be more appropriate, at least in the power and energy space, since there is a requirement around having a level of control and having a level of identity and access management. So we've been looking at different use cases all the way from energy markets, supply chain security and supply chain management. When we talk about procuring a certain device, or whether it is a software or a hardware, or even from a firmware point of view. We were looking, and we're still looking at some of the cybersecurity implications. So is this technology adding any value from a data integrity point of view? Through its distributed consensus point of view, is it facilitating some level of distributed ownership? I think our previous speakers talked about the evolving DER landscape. You have different entities playing playing in that ecosystem or an environment. So there is the sense of distributed networking and distributed ownership. Is there something that blockchain can add in that, right? Can this facilitate being as some sort of a trust anchor between these disparate entities? We also we've been looking into the identity and patch management that can tie to the supply chain security piece. And I have a couple of papers here if you're interested to read more about the core technical details around this research. We have an active Department of Energy project where 5 national labs, and all the way from NATL, NREL, AIMS, PNNL, and SLAC, working together towards a common goal to fundamentally understand blockchain and its implications in the energy space, and also build towards a testing environment that can be used by future researchers, including us and others, so they can quickly spin up a proof of concept environment or a test case and see if there is a value proposition or if blockchain can actually solve their problem. So this is an ongoing project, and a lot of interesting things are happening in this. It's in its early to mid stages, so we're in the theoretical stage, moving into more in building the software components around this. Basically, this is the last part of my presentation. This is where a good chunk of my work also has been focused on when it comes to blockchain applications. We've been looking into what it means to the energy markets or transactive energy systems. This is a diagram I think most of us are familiar with. We approached it from taking a look at the 5 different phases, right, all the way from registration, negotiation, operations, measurement, verification, and settlement. Looking at each of these steps, what are the engineering requirements? Forgetting about blockchain, looking at more from realizing these transactive energy system to work successfully. What are the engineering requirements that are associated with each of these five steps? And then what we did was we then looked at the different blockchain features, or at a very high level. Again, not from a blockchain from a particular technology point of view. We took a like a vendor agnostic approach, looking at in general what are the blockchain related features and how can some of these requirements can be realized or potentially realized, all the way starting from registration and qualification. For example, here these handshakes or sequence diagrams show the different level of interaction that is happening between a transactive node to the smart contract, and potentially what kind of attributes or components should be part of the smart contract, what kind of information can be on the ledger or off the ledger, and so on. And you would notice that some phases of those 5 transactive energy system phases may be less populated, right? Like, for example, if you look at negotiation, there's a lot happening here in terms of verifying the bid, checking for the validity of the bid, understanding the fail-safe operations, and doing a periodic autonomous verification, and etc. But if you come into the phases such as operations, there's not much happening here, which makes sense because from a blockchain is just another tool in a toolbox that is available for end users, whether it is utilities or someone else using this as a technology. So it is something at a data level, at an information or network level, can potentially improve or complement existing processes. But when it comes to actually moving the electrons, the flow of electrons, which is the energy and the wires, it has not much to do there, right? It can keep track of data and information is all. And again, when it comes down to the verification and settlement, and we are looking at things like ensuring that if the initially negotiated attributes are still fulfilled. If not, what kind of penalties or what kind of incentives can be triggered? How can that be done in an autonomous fashion? We have a very detailed report that talks about a lot of these interactions, and I do have a link in this particular slides. So what we did was, taking from a theoretical blueprint point of view, like the first approach we took, anyone can take that, and you can pick whatever the blockchain that you want to test it with, and you should be able to use the existing, that previously discussed process with whatever blockchain you are most interested in, and see how it actually works and how it compares with similar implementation with other blockchains. To prove that, or to at least actually test if our theory actually makes sense, we went with a permission private blockchain. In this particular case, we looked at Hyperledger Fabric and identified different types of participants and how these interactions happen, right? And this is just one of the several UML diagrams that explains the software implementation or realization of the previously discussed phases. You may have noticed that a lot of this is in the exploratory state, which is true because blockchain is a rapidly evolving technology. Just in the last 3 years, we have seen a lot of changes happening to this, by different vendors, by different technology developers, how For example, the initial phases of this blockchain-based DLTs that came out were focused a lot on integrity or data integrity, and we're seeing a lot of emphasis on confidentiality and access control and etc. In IEEE 2418.5, we're looking at kind of looking at it a vendor agnostic way, seeing how this can actually scale in an interoperable fashion. What are the standardization aspects that needs to be addressed for this to be, for someone to use this in a real world setting, right? So those are some of the attributes we're looking at. Yeah, that's pretty much concludes my presentation. I hope I try to do my best in covering it up in 15 minutes, but if you have any questions, reach out to me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think we are 6 minutes over, but if you can stay for 4 more minutes, we'll go through some additional questions that we have. Is that okay with the panelist?
Yeah, no
Okay.
problem.
That is fine with me, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think let me first ask Sri. So one question is that blockchain platform in terms of public-private consortium and the consensus algorithm, do you recommend for using that for DR management and local energy market? And also if aggregator is involved, is that still applicable?
Yeah, that's a good question. Referring to this slide, so in the Blossom project, one of the use cases we are looking at is actually related to DER coordination and control. We are specifically looking at some of the guidance that came out of, like, say, the Farrokh quarter 2222. We're looking at some of the grid architecture work, and identifying like a very simplified proof of concept with a set of assumptions in a setting where you have different fleet of DERs, multiple aggregators, then you have ESO and TSO, and how these interactions can happen. We, based on our research, like private permission blockchain seems to be more appropriate to our space in the power and energy space. And from the consensus point of view, voting-based consensus such as PBFT or IBFT or other BFT-based consensus, or even proof of authority-based consensus, seem to be interesting and appropriate, given that there are a lot of fundamental challenges with proof of work consensus. So I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So more in general, this question, now there are always two sides, right? From utility side, that they see the value in with reducing load, but still providing DR some compensation or incentive to participate. And then from the DR side, enough incentive to participate in the market, right? And especially in the areas where the price is low, what do you think about? And especially, I think this question is from Alex and Farrokh.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that.
Sure.
As you noticed, the product that these assets provide is not just energy. It is grid services, which really is really entrenched in the flexibility of these distributed resources to move up and down. So on the net, they may not even be consuming or reducing a whole lot of energy, but they will be providing that grid service. And that grid service in itself is valued. These both distribution companies and bulk power markets actually pay for those services. If you look at these different markets, I mentioned the example of regulation. Regulation prices run in the $10, $20 per megawatt per hour. And if you just look at that throughout the year, you see that that adds up to a lot of money. So it is not only energy. And besides, when it comes to energy, a lot of this thing is energy arbitrage, particularly with the emergence of storage. So you just store during the times where the price is low, and then produce when the price is high. And that lines up with what the grid needs. So basically, you should not only look at this as traditional thing that started this thing about 10, 15 years ago. Demand response was only load reduction. this is really providing a lot more, particularly with storage and hybrid resources, and the value that flexibility has for the grid operations.
Thank you. Alex, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Anurag. We have spent at least 3 years developing very detailed revenue models for market participation for the VPP, which consists of IoT devices and solar and storage. These revenue models are ISO specific. We have developed revenue models for pretty much every market in the US, and we're trying to do this in the European markets too. It's not the same picture everywhere. We prefer markets that pay for optionality, meaning make money on the capacity portion and not being activated all the time. For example, ERCOT has certain services that you get paid for capacity, but short-term capacity or a capacity on a quarterly basis. But you look at the historical data, they have been activated twice over the last 5 years. So we want the revenue stacking model. In other words, getting money from revenue sources when we participate at the same time. They are kind of vanilla type of products that one can participate and be financially healthy. There are more complicated games. Knowing the wholesale markets very well, we designed, as I said, about 15 markets around the world in Europe, Asia, US, North America, South America. There are complicated games like Farrokh mentioned, energy arbitrage. Well, energy arbitrage is an opportunistic game. You cannot go to an investor and you tell him, give me $3 million to do this for financing equipment, and I will make money based on revenue, based on arbitrage. Basically, they will kick you out of the door. The reason is that energy arbitrage will be wiped out in a matter of a few hours or a few days, so you cannot count on that income. You certainly can participate, but it requires extensive modeling capabilities. It's not simple. It's not simple. For example, ERCOT provides certain advantages compared to other markets for energy arbitrage, coupled with virtual offers that you liquidate in real time. But it's not an easy game. And if you are not careful, you can lose your shirt. So, and again, for predictable revenue projections, and part of we're a subscription model, part of the money we make from the wholesale markets flows back to the owner of the building, to the tenants. So we have contracts with these people. We cannot rely, we can start, let's say, from the basic services and stay healthy. And again, there are all these other games that we can play, including arbitrage. But for those type of games, we need to be very careful. That's all I can say. It requires extensive modeling. You can make mistakes, and we need to be very careful. In the short answer is yes. With the revenue models we have developed, especially as Farrokh said, with storage assets and so on, you can run a business like this and be financially healthy and give enough incentives to customers. The biggest problem is sign contracts with the customers. And what incentives do you give them? Now, customer engagement is the biggest expense we have in this business. Customer engagement is very important. It's a high cost. So this translates to a certain amount of dollars, and with the money we make, we'll cover this. Retrofitting a building of 100 units for us is $20,000. We have reduced the cost so much, it's $20,000. It's one-time fee. and then you can recover that in a very short amount of time by market participation. So nevertheless, you need to be very careful how you play this game. In markets, you will be exposed to deviations. If you are in the capacity market in PJM, they have a performance capacity market. If you fail to perform, you are penalized. Second time, the penalty is very high. Third time, you lose your share. So different markets have different penalty structures. Deviations beyond threshold is substantial. So you need to be very careful how to do this in a way you meet your instructions. That's why in my presentation, I talk about the yield statistics, how much you can get, the supply function, how conservative you can be based on risk you can take, and how you bid in the market so you will be able to minimize your exposure and your deviations. I hope that kind of...
Yeah, that's very useful. So one last question is to Robby and Sri. So all these DR services that we're talking about, I think we talked about security, and 2030.5 will help in that by doing that standard way. And then also blockchain is going to help more in peer-to-peer. But how do we get visibility when we also think about privacy? Right, so visibility into DR, doing the transaction in secure way, but at the same time keeping the privacy.
So I can take a stab first.
Sure.
I would say that some of it is dependent on contractual agreements. So if you're working through an aggregator or even working directly with, say, a DSO, you're going to need to have safeguards in place, contractual agreements to respect the privacy, and particularly when it comes to data sharing. So some of this is a cyber issue, right? You want to maintain privacy through protection, but you also want to maintain privacy through agreements and through policies of how that data might be shared, how that data might be used, etc. I think, for instance, you look at Europe, they've done a great job in terms of protecting privacy through the use of GDPR. And in some ways that has really strengthened the protection of privacy much more than in a lot of ways that technology could do. So a lot of it touches on the standards and the technology, but much of it comes to the policy.
That's true.
And yeah, agreeing with Robby and building upon that, right? Like, blockchain, like I said, it's just another tool in the toolbox, right? So these policies and best practices drive the implementation. That's one of the reasons why we thought that, at least we still think based on our research, that private permission that has more control on what entities can do probably is more appropriate for experimenting in this space, right? Because from the aggregator's point of view, you have these different verticals of interactions that are happening, and there is a level of access control that is required. Who can see what kind of data, and who can see that includes measurements, signals back and forth, that includes metadata. So whether the end user is using, whether the researcher is using blockchain or some other distributed architecture, essentially looking at the policies and standardized methods and translating them into, if they're looking at autonomous or automatic interactions, translating them into code, which is software, right? And that's why I would say that don't go from how can this particular blockchain fix the problem, rather go from what are the requirements from the engineering point of view, then see what technology might be most appropriate. Let's say if blockchain has some value proposition, then drill down into what's most appropriate from a consensus, from permission or permissionless architecture point of view, then go into the experimental phase, right? It should be driving from the top down. So that's my take.
Thank you. Well, I think there is one question more. What would be the expected timeline to see distributed ledger transactive technology in the implementation phase?
If you don't mind, I can take a first shot. That's a really hard question, right? Because the technology is changing constantly. Like if we look at what happened in 2017, if we compare that to right now, forget even all that. let's look at Hyperledger 1.1 to 2.0, changes that happened between 2019 to 2020, significantly different, right? So right now we're seeing a lot of vendors from a technology development point of view coming up with their own structure, their own protocols. There's a lot of ad hocness and there's a lot of proprietary stuff happening. I think the fundamental question is to address, what is the standardization and interoperability looks in this case. So that will pave a path towards scalability and more in the cybersecurity integration or use of this technology. And that's when that kind of shows the path towards taking the research and experimental work towards more in the reality or deployment stuff, right? Because there are a lot of questions we need to ask in terms of how will this scale, right? Like how, from a long-term maintainability point of view. I think one of the speakers talked from the aggregator's point of view, what if one of the aggregators goes out of business, right? But in this case, what if one of the blockchain vendor goes out of the business? Who's responsible for the network? Who's responsible for all the data, right? So there are a lot of fundamental questions that needs to be answered before we think about a lot of deployable large-scale implementations. There are a lot of interesting short-scale, small-scale pilots that are happening, which is great because these pilots are helping us discover more and more questions. Honestly, at this point, there are more questions than answers. So,
well, I'm more optimistic on that. We have a 3-year project with the European Union to have pilots, actually large-scale pilots, in 4 countries: Greece, Italy, Germany, and England, at Bristol. So with different use cases, but it seems that again, based on transactive energy model with blockchain. So if the question is when we're going to see large-scale implementations, that's a difficult question. But pilots, as Sri said, there are many, and were implemented some, and actually large-scale pilots. So I believe in the next couple of years, you will see many of those popping up all over the place. If this leads to a massive implementation in large systems, remains to be seen. But definitely there are many pilot work, and there are plenty of money in different jurisdictions to really do pilots based on technologies you have developed for transactive energy, based on blockchain, and we can experiment with micropayments, with fiat money, with crypto money. So I just want to tell you, Europe is a gold mine for this. They have allocated a huge budget. This ties to sustainability, okay? Ties to sustainability. And there are a lot of calls to participate and win projects like this, specifically in this area, in many places. So I'm more optimistic that you will see a lot of work in this area. Again, massive implementation remains to be seen.
Yeah. Actually, if you don't mind, one last comment. Alex makes a very good point, right? Like when we talk about pilots, what market are we looking at is important, like European versus American, in terms of the number of utilities and other things, in terms of requirements that we have. So that matters as well. So thanks for contextualizing that.
Yeah, just one last comment, if you don't mind. It's also, in addition to region, it is the specific use case or application dependent. I remember 20 years ago at California ISO, there was this thing that was called physical interest trade. And one of the issues there was to make sure you don't have double sale or people do not sell more than what a power plant generates. I know we went through an extensive, elaborate process to come up with a software implementation for physical interest trade. Blockchain did not exist at that time. But now with the capabilities that blockchain provides, it's very easy to trace those things and make sure that those physical interest trades, there is no double sale. So there are some applications in which blockchain is extremely useful. There are some others where you try to see if the blockchain works. So these are 2 different categories. I just wanted to make that comment here.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think there was very interesting discussion, and I don't see any more questions. We can, of course, continue. It's such an interesting topic. But thanks again for sharing your time and expertise for this panel. I think that went very well, and I'm sure that a lot of students here benefited from that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the
you.
invitation.
Bye-bye.
And the questions. Bye-bye.
Everybody, bye-bye.